This story is about a guy named Joseph. As fate would have it, by the time he turned 35, his life had turned into a real torture. Every day was indistinguishable from the other. His weekdays were unbearably dull, and he had long lost the taste for life. But once upon a time, he was one of the most charming and popular young men in his school and college. He had a bright and promising youth, filled with achievements and admiration from those around him. Even in school, Joseph caught attention with his attractive appearance, charisma, and athletic accomplishments. He actively participated in school events, often stood out with his sports victories and leadership qualities. Beautiful girls surrounded him, and his company was sought after by anyone who wanted to experience a bit of his energy and self-confidence. When he entered college, Joseph continued to reach new heights. He was irresistible, both externally and internally. As a rugby player, he demonstrated himself as a leader and a force to be relied upon in the team. His energy, physical strength, and sharp mind made him an unparalleled competitor and enabled him to achieve great results. Thanks to his popularity and sociability, Joseph gained a large number of friends and devoted admirers. His company was always desired at parties and other social events. He was surrounded by people who admired his athletic achievements, charm, and ability to connect with others. But he was not destined to bask in glory forever. His life irreversibly changed due to one incident. One evening, when Joseph, tired from intense workouts, was heading home, he felt a strange presence behind him. He turned around and noticed an unfamiliar guy staring at him intently. This guy, named Mike, turned out to be the ex-boyfriend of the girl Joseph was in love with. Their relationship had ended a few months ago when she confessed her feelings for Joseph. Mike felt anger and jealousy, deciding to take revenge on Joseph for stealing his girl. Mike, who lived in the neighborhood, decided to gather a few of his friends who shared his negative feelings towards Joseph. They devised a sinister plan and decided to ambush him on the deserted streets he usually walked on his way home. As Joseph unsuspectingly walked down the empty streets, a mob of thugs suddenly pounced on him. Their sinister smiles and aggressive glares were evident. A brutal beating ensued, with each attacker trying to land as many blows on Joseph as possible. Despite the shock and unexpectedness of the events, he fought back with desperation, fending off his assailants. Mike and his accomplices were determined to seek revenge and showed no intention of stopping. They were ready to inflict maximum harm and humiliation upon Joseph. But at one moment, when Joseph was already feeling exhaustion and fatigue, one of the assailants grabbed a club and delivered a powerful blow to his back. That treacherous strike from behind became a decisive moment. Joseph lost consciousness, his body collapsing onto the cold asphalt while the attackers disappeared into the night. After some time on the dark and desolate nighttime streets, a passerby stumbled upon Joseph's lifeless body. As they approached closer, they were horrified by what they saw. The young man had been beaten to such an extent that his face had turned into a grotesque mask of suffering. It was disfigured, covered in cuts and bruised marks. Blood was flowing from his mouth, staining his lips with a grim shade. Joseph lay motionless, unable to move or make a sound. The passerby immediately realized the gravity of the situation. They promptly called for an ambulance, describing the dispatcher the scene and the severity of Joseph's injuries. Soon, the ambulance arrived at the scene. The paramedics quickly recognized the seriousness of the situation and did everything possible to stabilize the injured person. Being on the brink of death, Joseph was carefully placed on a stretcher, and the ambulance rushed to the hospital as quickly as possible, trying to minimize the time needed to save him. When Joseph arrived at the hospital, the medical team took him in urgently and with utmost care. He was immediately brought to the specialized intensive care unit, where doctors and nurses fought for his life. A complex surgery was performed to stop the bleeding and address the most severe injuries. However, his condition was so critical that he fell into a deep coma. For the next 6 months, Joseph remained in a comatose state, under the watchful eyes of doctors and medical staff who fought for every breath he took. Despite their efforts, there were moments when they began to doubt whether he would pull through. However, Joseph's parents never lost hope and faith in a miracle. And then, after 7 agonizing months, something incredible happened. The nurse caring for Joseph noticed a slight movement of his left thumb. It was a small but significant sign of life that spurred them into action. His parents were urgently called so they could be by his side in this pivotal moment. The next day, as the sun rays streamed through the hospital room window, Joseph slowly opened his eyes. It wasn't easy to adjust to the light and comprehend his situation after such a prolonged absence. He felt weakness and an indescribable sensation. In that moment, an irresistible desire to live awakened within him. This chapter of Joseph's story was a time of dark suffering and hope. He endured unimaginable trials and teetered on the brink of life and death. But his willpower and the support of loved ones helped him overcome the difficulties. Now, a new phase of his struggle began: the fight for recovery and a return to a normal life. After the horrific attack, Joseph found himself on the verge of physical and speech impairment. His voice was gone, and instead of coherent speech, he could only mumble something unintelligible. Matthew and Sean, his parents, watched him with indescribable heartache. They witnessed their once energetic and strong son gradually coming back to life, step by step overcoming his physical and speech challenges. As a result of the attack, Joseph sustained serious injuries. His leg was broken, several ribs were fractured, his lower jaw was shattered, and there was a crack in his pelvis. Additionally, he suffered a severe concussion. His body and face looked completely different. Numerous scars, bruises, and swellings disfigured his once beautiful and attractive face. But Matthew and Sean didn't give up. They stood by Joseph, supporting him every minute of his long journey to recovery. They helped him gradually regain strength and overcome physical limitations. Physiotherapists and rehabilitation specialists worked with Joseph to restore his strength and mobility. Every step was painful and challenging, but Joseph never gave up. He pushed through the pain and fear, moving forward, knowing that a greater battle lay ahead. In addition to physical rehabilitation, Joseph started undergoing special sessions with speech therapists to regain his speech. He started with simple sounds and words, slowly pronouncing each sound with maximum concentration. It was exhausting and slow, but he was persistent and motivated. His parents rejoiced every time they heard his weak but confident sounds. Alongside physical and speech recovery, Joseph had to deal with the psychological aftermath of the attack. He experienced post-traumatic stress and fear of further violence. Psychologists helped him cope with emotional difficulties, restoring his confidence and self-esteem. Every day, Joseph took small yet significant steps forward. He diligently worked on his physical and speech recovery, overcoming all the difficulties in his path. His willpower and the support of his parents were key factors in his struggle. With each passing day, he came closer to his goal, to return to a normal life and rebuild his future. After the horrific attack, Joseph became self-conscious about being in public. His face, disfigured by the injuries, elicited discomfort and even repulsion from those around him. Over time, he lost friends, and people who were once close began to reject him. Joseph didn't blame them for their reaction. He understood that in his current state, he could be unpleasant and unwanted by anyone. Soon, a period came when Joseph faced numerous surgeries that could somehow improve his physical condition. He spent long 3 years moving from one clinic to another, undergoing a series of medical interventions. These surgeries were painful and complex, but Joseph was ready to go through them, hoping for a positive outcome. During these years, Joseph lived in isolation. His only companions were nurses and doctors who took care of him and performed recovery procedures. His contact with the outside world was limited. He didn't see anyone except medical staff and lawyers who came to take his testimony as part of the investigation into the attack. It was a long and difficult journey, filled with physical and emotional pain. However, through the course of the investigation, the perpetrators who caused Joseph such serious injuries were apprehended and convicted. They received harsh punishments, but it didn't alleviate his suffering in any way. His old life could no longer be restored. Over the years, Joseph gradually began to recover, but the long years of loneliness left an indelible mark on his psyche. He became withdrawn and found it difficult to communicate with people due to his impaired speech, which was a consequence of the attack. Once a promising and energetic young man turned into a disabled person who became accustomed to avoiding social interactions. He suffered from low self-esteem and rarely spoke to anyone. Joseph found a job as a cook in a small cafe where he spent his days. Every day, after work, he would return home on the subway to his one-bedroom apartment, where he spent long and sleepless nights. Upon returning home, Joseph usually didn't even turn on the lights. He entered an empty and quiet room enveloped in darkness and lay down on the bed. His thoughts were filled with sadness and a longing for this nightmare to finally end. In those moments, he dreamed of returning to a normal life where he could be himself again. On one of those evenings, when Joseph's soul was saturated with sadness, he left work and headed to the subway station. He was exhausted from battling his own demons. Joseph slowly descended the stairs to the subway station. The late night shrouded the platform in darkness, and the only source of light, the pale lamps placed along the walls, created an eerie illumination. Joseph's heart pounded harder as he entered the realm of the underground. The station was empty, and the silence only intensified his sense of loneliness and vulnerability. Out of habit, Joseph covered his face with his palm and pretended to cough. It was his strategy, an attempt to blend in and pretend to be sick in order to avoid attention and conversations. He didn't want to come face to face with anyone from his past, anyone who could recognize him and recall the horrific event that had forever changed his life. Joseph feared that if someone familiar saw him here, it would draw attention to his tragic story. He didn't want to be recognized, to have his disfigured face and experiences discussed. Pain and fear still resided in his heart, and every encounter with the past only heightened his internal anguish. So Joseph, with his face covered in fake cough, walked along the platform, trying to remain unnoticed. His eyes briefly glanced at the dark corners of the station, and he couldn't shake off the feeling that someone was watching him from the shadows. Joseph's nerves were on edge, and every sound, every rustle aroused his suspicion. Joseph stopped at the subway station and looked around in astonishment. There wasn't a single passenger in sight. Usually, even late at night, there were people rushing about, going about their business. But now the station seemed deserted and forgotten. In the deafening silence, only the faint noise of ventilation and trains reached Joseph's ears. In the corner of the station, a homeless dog lay. Its eyes, filled with sorrow and pity, met Joseph's gaze. In that abandoned and neglected place where dirt and litter prevailed, this dog was the only living being. Its presence added a touch of poignancy and sadness to the surroundings. The subway station was in a sorry state. Dirt covered the floors and trash was scattered everywhere. Newspapers and advertising leaflets left behind by passengers swayed in the air, creating a peculiar sight. The entire atmosphere of the station was infused with the remnants of past hustle and bustle, now resting in stillness. However, despite its dilapidation and emptiness, Joseph felt a strange sense of relief. In this dark and abandoned place, he found some peace and tranquility. Maybe it was because of the silence that enveloped the station or the feeling of temporary escape from his troubles. As if forgetting about his worries, Joseph felt a desire to stay here longer, to lose himself in this quiet and empty atmosphere. Perhaps it was his getaway from reality, at least for a while. In this place where time seemed to stand still, he found a certain serenity that had eluded him for so long. The dog in the corner of the station continued to look at him with its melancholic eyes, as if understanding his state. Maybe it, too, sought refuge from the cruel reality in this deserted station. Standing in place, lost in his thoughts, and feeling a strange tranquility, He didn't pay attention to the faint sounds coming from the tunnel through which trains usually emerged. At first, it was a muted, rustling, unclear, and indefinite. But Joseph ignored it, assuming it was just ordinary ambient noises. However, any normal person in such a situation would have felt uneasy and uncomfortable. The station looked eerie and neglected. The flickering lights intermittently illuminated the peeling walls and broken tiles with a dim glow. The station was in a state of decay, with tiles partially collapsed and forming hazardous angles. Around Joseph, there was complete silence, except for the sounds emanating from the tunnel and the rustling of litter scattered everywhere. The only living being in the station was the homeless dog, which still watched him with its sad eyes. Gradually, from the depths of the tunnel, against the backdrop of muffled sounds reminiscent of the dragging of a heavy sack on the ground, Joseph began to perceive clearer noises. It seemed as if the sack occasionally leaped over the concrete supports on which the tracks were placed. The rustling and dull thuds sounded monotonous, but undeniably drew nearer to him. However, despite all the strangeness happening, Joseph didn't pay much attention to those sounds. His mind was occupied with other thoughts, other mysteries he was pursuing. The subway station and its atmosphere, the calmness and tranquility, seemed to engulf his attention, not allowing him to be distracted by external events. The gloomy scene still prevailed around him. The flickering light bulbs created an eerie illumination, and the tiles on the walls were partially collapsed, indicating abandonment and decay. There was no one around except for the homeless dog, which remained loyal to its corner, attentively watching Joseph. Despite the horrifying appearance of the station, Joseph strangely felt good here. He sensed a peculiar calmness and tranquility, as if this dilapidated and forgotten corner of the subway was his refuge from the outside world and his problems. Suddenly, a bright beam of light poured out from the tunnel, illuminating the subway station. All the sounds that had filled the space just a moment ago abruptly ceased, and a grave silence fell around. Even the rustling of litter and the trembling of the air subsided. The tunnel, from which sounds had previously emanated, now glowed with a bright white light, as if breaking through from another dimension. Silently, a train emerged from the mysterious tunnel, causing genuine astonishment in Joseph. He had never seen such trains in his life. The entire train was completely white and shiny, devoid of any dirt or signs of use. The train seemed perfect, as if it had just been created. It was completely empty, devoid of any souls. The train stopped in front of Joseph, and the doors automatically opened, as if inviting him inside. A feeling that time had stopped engulfed Joseph, and all his problems and worries ceased to matter. He felt calm in his soul, as if he had entered a different dimension where time stood still, and everything else disappeared from his consciousness. Driven by an unknown feeling, Joseph left his spot and headed towards the train doors. There was an enticing attraction inside, as if it was the answer to his aspirations and desires. Joseph stepped over the threshold of the train, and the doors closed behind him. Joseph chose a seat at the very end of the train car. He sat on the soft seat and looked out the window. The stray dog still accompanied him with a sympathetic gaze. The train began to move. However, it was completely unnoticed. There were no sudden jolts or the sound of wheels on the tracks. The movement started as silently and smoothly as everything else at this mysterious station. Joseph felt the carriage gently gliding on the rails, as if floating on an invisible stream. Gradually, a gentle and melodious music filled the train car. It was a melody that seemed to uplift and lull Joseph at the same time. The sounds of the music dulled his thoughts and transported him to a world of harmony and tranquility. He closed his eyes and allowed the melody to envelop him like a warm and pleasant blanket. Under the influence of the music and the silent movement of the train, Joseph sank into a state of complete bliss and peace. So Joseph continued his journey, immersed in his own thoughts and the magical ambiance of the train. He allowed himself to relax and simply enjoy this moment, without wondering where exactly he was heading. Joseph continued to savor the melody and the smooth motion of the train as the station faded away. But suddenly, something started to change in the carriage. First, he noticed strange objects outside the window, resembling shooting stars. They were bright and moved at an unusual speed, leaving a faint trail of light behind. Surprised by this spectacle, Joseph turned away from the window and looked inside the train car. And then something completely strange began to appear before his eyes. Luminous dots slowly emerged around him, like tiny stars surrounded by a delicate haze. They floated gracefully in the air, creating a magical atmosphere. Instantly, fear started creeping into Joseph's soul. His serenity and peace crumbled under the pressure of these inexplicable phenomena. For the first time throughout the journey, he felt uncertainty and worry. The glowing dots and haze created a sense of unreality, as if he found himself in a world where the laws of physics and reality ceased to exist. Joseph desperately tried to understand what was happening. He felt how fear slowly seized his consciousness, permeating every cell of his body. Suddenly, he saw silhouettes of people appearing, one after another, on the seats in front of him. They appeared and disappeared, replaced by others. At first, fear and horror overwhelmed Joseph, but upon hearing what these unfortunate shadows were saying, he couldn't hold back his tears. The girl who appeared on a seat nearby was sobbing uncontrollably. This ghostly silhouette was in deep despair. Joseph could feel her pain. The ghost of the girl murmured to herself, "My poor child never even saw the light of this world. My little girl will never get to enjoy life. I won't be able to take her to school. I won't be there to support her through her hardships. I won't see her go on her first date. My baby is dead." Joseph understood that this woman had lost her child. Tears welled up in his eyes upon hearing her words. Then he noticed the ghost of a man holding some documents. He barely whispered to himself, "Inoperable brain tumor. The doctor said I have at best 6 months to live. And what kind of life will it be if I can't even go to the bathroom on my own? Funny how I always thought death was something that happened to others, but never to me." After these words, the ghost disappeared. Joseph had mixed feelings. He experienced an unearthly fear, but deep down, he felt that he was safe. Suddenly, he heard a phone ring. The ghost of a mature woman who appeared right in front of him picked up the receiver. Joseph heard a voice coming from the phone, uttering dreadful words. "Sarah, I regret to inform you that your husband was involved in a car accident. Unfortunately, the doctors couldn't save him. You must come to the morgue to retrieve his body." After that words, the woman dropped the phone from her hands, her face contorted in agony. Before finally vanishing, she looked straight into Joseph's eyes. Her gaze was highly expressive. It was as if she was saying, "Don't think you've lost everything. There are people who have lost much more than you." At that moment, Joseph felt shame and embarrassment. Ghosts kept appearing in the train, each with their own tragedy. Joseph couldn't bear to listen to their stories anymore. He couldn't hold back his tears. The train continued to move through emptiness for a while. Soon, it stopped at the same station where Joseph had boarded. The carriage emptied once again, and silence filled the air. Exhausted and unaware of what had just happened to him, Joseph collapsed onto the cold floor. The same stray dog looked at him with its pitiful gaze. Joseph was overwhelmed with tears from what he had heard and seen. The dog stood up from its spot and pressed against him. He felt the warmth of the animal. Soon, overcome by exhaustion, Joseph fell asleep, and when he woke up, he saw that the subway station was packed with people rushing to work. Everywhere was bustling with haste and chaos. Crowds hurried past him. The station has again turned into an ordinary, noisy staging post for human souls.